The late afternoon sun shimmered across the surface of the lake, casting golden reflections that danced like fireflies. A small wooden boat swayed gently as Elias, a man in his late 30s, pulled the oars through the calm water. His young daughter, Lily, giggled at the rippling waves, clutching a worn stuffed bear close to her chest. She was a curious child, her green eyes wide with wonder as she leaned over to peer at the fish swimming beneath the surface. "Lily, sit back, sweetheart," Clara called from the other end of the boat, her voice warm yet firm. She was busy unpacking sandwiches from a wicker basket, her movements deliberate and graceful. "We don't want you falling in." "I won't, Mommy," Lily replied, her voice filled with playful defiance. She sat cross-legged but kept glancing over the edge, her fascination with the water unshaken. Clara smiled faintly, though an edge of unease tugged at her. She glanced at Elias, who caught her gaze and gave a reassuring nod. "She's fine," he said softly, his deep voice steady. "We're here to relax." But Clara's unease didn't fade. As she moved the basket aside, her heart sank. "Elias," she said suddenly, her voice tightening, "I forgot to put Lily's life jacket on. It's still in the bag." Elias stopped rowing and turned to look. "Clara, it's fine. She's right here." But Clara was already reaching into the bag, her hands shaking slightly. She pulled out the bright orange life jacket and leaned toward Lily. "Come here, sweetie. Let's put this on, just in case." Lily frowned. "Do I have to?" "Yes," Clara said firmly, her fingers fumbling with the straps. "It's important." As she worked to secure the jacket, a sudden gust of wind swept across the lake, ruffling the water and tilting the boat slightly. "Hold still, Lily," Clara said, her voice sharper now, her focus entirely on fastening the straps. The moment was fleeting, almost imperceptible. A stronger gust followed, and the boat rocked again, this time harder. Lily let out a startled yelp as she lost her balance. Her small hands flailed, the stuffed bear slipping from her grasp as she toppled over the edge into the cold water below. "Lily!" Clara screamed, her voice piercing through the serene afternoon. Without hesitation, she dove in after her daughter, the life jacket forgotten on the floor of the boat. Elias froze for a split second before the weight of what had happened hit him. "Clara! Lily!" he shouted, his oars clattering as he scrambled to follow them. The water, once calm and inviting, now seemed vast and menacing, its surface broken by erratic ripples. Clara surfaced, gasping for air. "She's here." "I can't see her," she cried, her hands thrashing as she searched. Her hair clung to her face, her panic palpable. Elias plunged into the water, the cold stealing his breath as he struggled to orient himself. His powerful strokes carried him toward Clara, his eyes scanning the dark depths for any sign of Lily. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Clara sobbed, her voice hoarse from shouting her daughter's name. "Lily!" "Please!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Elias dove repeatedly, his lungs burning, but the lake refused to give up its secret. Each time he surfaced, the desperation in Clara's eyes grew. The golden light of the setting sun now felt cruel, casting a serene glow over a scene of unimaginable chaos. Finally, exhausted and defeated, Elias managed to drag Clara back to the boat. She fought against him, her arms reaching for the water, but he held her tightly. "We'll find her," he whispered, though his voice cracked with doubt. "We'll find her." Hours later, the search teams arrived, their boats combing the lake under the dim light of the moon. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her gaze never left the water. Elias stood a few feet away, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. He had failed them both, his wife and his daughter. The searchers found nothing but Lily's stuffed bear, tangled in the reeds near the shore. A somber silence fell over the group as one of the rescuers handed it to Clara. She clutched it to her chest, her sobs echoing across the still water. As the night wore on, Elias and Clara were left with an unbearable truth. Lily was gone. The lake had swallowed her whole, leaving behind only an empty boat, a forgotten life jacket, and a bear that would never again bring comfort to its owner. They returned home in silence, their once vibrant house now hollow and cold. The sound of Lily's laughter no longer echoed through its halls. The warmth of her presence had been replaced by a void too vast to fill. For Elias, the guilt was unbearable. Every detail of that day replayed in his mind. The forgotten life jacket, the sound of her fall, the way her bear floated aimlessly on the surface. Each memory was a dagger to his heart, a reminder of what he had lost. Clara retreated into herself, her grief consuming her. She spent hours clutching the bear, rocking back and forth in the empty nursery. Elias tried to reach her, but his own pain was too great. They were two broken souls, drifting further apart with each passing day. In the weeks that followed, the house fell silent. The laughter, the love, the joy, it had all vanished, carried away by the same cruel wind that had taken Lily. And though the lake had calmed, its surface shimmering once again under the sun, it would forever hold their daughter's memory, a haunting reflection of what had been lost. The house had grown unbearably quiet. 2 decades had passed, but the silence weighed heavier with each year, filling every corner with echoes of what was lost. Elias, now in his late 50s, sat by the window of his study, staring at the garden outside. Once vibrant with laughter and Lily's playful squeals, it was now overgrown and unkempt, a reflection of the void in his soul. Time had etched deep lines into his face, but they were not the lines of age alone. They were the carvings of sorrow, regret, and unspoken grief. Clara had left 5 years after the accident. She couldn't bear the weight of their loss or the growing distance between them. One morning, without a word, she packed a small suitcase and left. Elias had watched from the window, too numb to stop her, his heart breaking anew as her figure disappeared down the driveway. He never remarried. There was no room in his heart for anyone else. It was still wholly consumed by the memory of Lily. Every morning, he walked past her empty room, now a preserved shrine to a life frozen in time. The pastel walls, the little bed with its neatly arranged stuffed animals, and the faded photographs all remained untouched, as if waiting for her return. Elias's days had become a monotonous cycle. He spent most of his time managing his late father's business, though his passion for it had long since faded. It was a distraction, a way to fill the endless hours. But every evening, without fail, he found himself at the edge of the lake, staring at the still waters that had taken everything from him. The lake never changed. Its surface remained calm, serene even, as if mocking the storm it had unleashed on his life. Elias would sit on a weathered wooden bench, clutching Lily's stuffed bear, now faded and worn from years of handling. He talked to her as though she were still there, his voice soft and filled with longing. "Do you remember, Lily?" he whispered one evening, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You used to laugh so much. You said the fish looked like they were dancing just for you." His voice broke, and he pressed the bear to his face. "I should have been faster. I should have held on tighter. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." The years had not dulled his guilt. If anything, it had grown sharper, cutting deeper with each passing day. He blamed himself for not insisting on the life jacket sooner, for not reacting quickly enough, for every decision that had led to that fateful moment. The burden was his alone to carry, and he bore it willingly, as penance for what he had lost. The few friends he had left tried to pull him out of his grief, urging him to sell the house and move closer to the city, to start anew, but Elias couldn't. The house, the lake, even the pain, they were all he had left of Lily. To leave them behind would be to abandon her memory, and that was something he would never do. Every anniversary of the accident, Elias returned to the lake at dawn. He brought fresh flowers and placed them at the shoreline, a quiet ritual of remembrance. This year was no different. The morning air was crisp, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the mist. He knelt by the water, his hands trembling as he set down a bouquet of lilies, her favorite flower. "I miss you, Lily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of you." As he sat there, his thoughts drifted to Clara. He wondered where she was, whether she had found peace or if the grief still haunted her as it did him. He had written to her once, years ago, but she never responded. Perhaps she blamed him, as he blamed himself. Perhaps she had finally moved on. He didn't know, and part of him was afraid to find out. Elias rose slowly, his joints stiff from kneeling on the cold ground. He looked out at the water one last time before turning back toward the house. It loomed in the distance, a grand yet lifeless structure. Its empty halls and darkened rooms were a constant reminder of the family that once filled it with light. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The scent of polished wood and faint lavender still lingered, a ghost of Clara's presence. He walked to the mantel, where a single photograph of Lily rested in a silver frame. She was smiling in the picture, her eyes bright with mischief as she held the stuffed bear. Elias touched the frame gently, his fingers lingering on her face. "I'll see you again, Lily," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Someday." The bustling streets of the town were alive with the sounds of everyday life. Vendors called out to passers-by, the aroma of fresh bread and roasted coffee mingling in the air. Among the shops that lined the cobblestone streets was a small, unassuming store tucked between larger storefronts. Its modest sign read, "Timeless Keepsakes," and the windows displayed rows of vintage watches and clocks, their faces glinting in the afternoon sun. Inside, Isabel stood behind the counter, meticulously cleaning the gears of an antique pocket watch. Her wavy dark brown hair was pulled into a loose braid, and her hazel eyes reflected her concentration as she worked. In her mid-20s, she had inherited the shop from the woman who had raised her, a quiet yet fiercely loving figure who had passed away a few years earlier. Isabel had always felt at home among the intricate mechanisms of clocks. She loved the precision, the way every tiny gear and spring played its part in creating something whole. Yet there was always an undercurrent of restlessness within her, a sense that something was missing, though she could never quite put it into words. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see a man in his early 60s entering the shop. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed, and his suit, though slightly worn, gave him an air of quiet dignity. There was a heaviness in his eyes, as though they carried the weight of years of sorrow. "Good afternoon," Isabel said with a polite smile, setting the watch aside. "How can I help you?" The man hesitated, his gaze sweeping across the shelves before settling on a vintage pocket watch displayed under the glass counter. "I saw this in the window," he said, his voice deep but tinged with weariness. "It caught my eye." Isabel nodded and carefully retrieved the watch, placing it in his hands. "It's a beautiful piece," she said, "late 1800s, fully restored. It's one of my favorites." Elias, for it was him, turned the watch over in his hands, running his thumb across the smooth surface. But as he admired the craftsmanship, his gaze drifted to Isabel's hand. There, on her right hand, was a crescent moon-shaped birthmark. His breath caught. "That mark," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Isabel frowned, puzzled. "Oh, this?" She held up her hand, glancing at the birthmark. "I've had it forever. Why?" Elias's heart raced. He swallowed hard, his mind reeling. "My daughter," he began, his voice trembling. "She had the same mark." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Isabel blinked, unsure how to respond. "Your daughter?" she asked cautiously. "She disappeared when she was 4, Elias said, his eyes locked on her hand. She had this exact birthmark, a crescent moon, just like yours." Isabel's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, her voice tinged with sympathy but also discomfort. "But I don't think I'm your daughter. I've lived here my whole life. My mother, she would have told me." Elias shook his head, his voice growing steadier but no less emotional. "Do you know where she found you?" "Who your real parents were?" Isabel stiffened slightly. "She told me I was adopted," she admitted, "but she never talked about it much. She said a fisherman brought me to her after finding me near a lake. That's all I know." "A lake?" Elias repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His knees felt weak. "Bluebell Lake?" Yes, Isabel said, tilting her head. How did you? Elias interrupted, his emotions spilling over. Because that's where it happened. That's where I lost her. My Lily. Isabel took a step back, her expression a mix of confusion and unease. I don't know what to say, she said, her voice shaking. This is a lot. Please, Elias said, his tone urgent but gentle. I know this sounds impossible, but everything lines up. The lake, the birthmark. I just need to know. Do you have anything from that time? Anything your mother might have kept? Isabel hesitated. There's a box of things she left me, she said finally. I haven't looked through it in years. Can I see it? Elias asked, his voice cracking. Please. If there's even a chance. Isabel bit her lip, clearly torn. Finally, she nodded. Wait here, she said, disappearing into the back room. Elias stood alone, his heart pounding. Every part of him ached with the possibility that this young woman, standing mere feet away, could be the daughter he had mourned for 2 decades. It was a fragile hope, but it was the strongest he had felt in years. When Isabel returned, she carried a small wooden box, its surface worn and scratched from age. She placed it on the counter and opened it carefully. Inside were a handful of items, a baby's blanket, a few faded photographs, and a small charm bracelet with a crescent moon charm. Elias's breath caught. He reached out, his hands trembling, and picked up the bracelet. This was hers, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I gave this to Lily when she was born. Isabel stared at him, her own emotions surfacing. Are you sure? She asked, though her voice was barely audible. Elias nodded, clutching the bracelet as though it were a lifeline. I'm sure, he said, his voice breaking. You're my daughter. Days passed after the encounter in the shop, but Elias's mind could not rest. He clung to the memory of Isabel's face, her voice, and most of all, that birthmark, a detail so small, yet so significant. He tried to reach out to her again, but Isabel didn't respond. She needed time. Time to process the possibility that her life was not what she had always believed. Elias Braum, however, didn't have much time to spare. His health had been fragile for years, his body worn down by years of stress and grief. He had ignored the symptoms for too long. Shortness of breath, persistent fatigue, and the occasional sharp pain in his chest. But now, they had become impossible to ignore. One evening, while sitting in his study, a sudden wave of dizziness forced him to the floor. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling the room. His doctor, a kindly man with a firm demeanor, stood at his side, his expression serious. Mr. Elias, the doctor began, his voice calm but direct. You've been ignoring your health for far too long. Your heart is under significant strain. If you don't take this seriously, the consequences could be severe. Elias nodded weakly, his energy drained. I understand, he murmured. But there's something I need to do first. Isabel had tried to focus on her life, burying herself in the familiar routine of repairing watches and tending to the shop. But her mind kept drifting back to Elias and the box she had shown him. The way he had clutched the bracelet, tears streaming down his face, haunted her. It was as though a piece of his soul had been restored, and yet she couldn't bring herself to believe it fully. How could she? Late one evening, as she was closing up the shop, her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something urged her to answer. Miss Isabel? A man's voice asked. Yes, this is she replied cautiously. This is Dr. Hampton. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Elias. He's unwell and has asked to see you. He insisted it was urgent. Her heart sank. Is he dying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated. He's stable for now, but his condition is serious. He's asked for you specifically. Isabel closed her eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. After a long pause, she said softly, I'll come. The next afternoon, Isabel found herself standing at the wrought iron gates of Elias's estate. The mansion loomed in the distance, its grandeur almost overwhelming. She had imagined his life would be comfortable, but this was something entirely different. The long driveway was flanked by manicured gardens, blooming with vibrant flowers that seemed almost too perfect to be real. A fountain bubbled quietly near the entrance, its spray catching the sunlight like tiny diamonds. A housekeeper greeted her and led her inside. Isabel's breath caught as she stepped into the grand foyer, the marble floors gleaming beneath a massive chandelier. The walls were lined with ornate moldings, and every corner of the space seemed to exude wealth and history. She was guided up a wide staircase and down a long hallway until they reached a large bedroom. The housekeeper knocked gently before opening the door. "He's expecting you," she said, stepping aside to let Isabel in. Elias lay in a massive bed, his face pale and drawn. The room was filled with soft light from the tall windows, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. A small table beside him held a glass of water, a book, and a photograph of a little girl clutching a stuffed bear. When Elias saw Isabel, a weak but genuine smile spread across his face. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. Isabel hesitated before stepping closer. "I wasn't sure if I should," she admitted. "I'm glad you did," Elias replied. He gestured to a chair by his bedside. "Please, sit." She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Isabel glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the photograph. "Is that her?" she asked softly. Elias followed her gaze and nodded. "Yes, that's Lily." Isabel studied the picture. The little girl's face, with her bright green eyes and curly blonde hair, seemed to carry an echo of familiarity. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice barely audible. "She was," Elias said, his eyes glistening, "and so are you." Isabel looked away, unsure of how to respond. "Why did you ask me to come?" she asked finally. Elias took a deep breath, his frailty evident. "Because I want to know you," he said simply. "And because, if there's even a chance that you are her, I need to tell you how much I love you. I need you to know what you mean to me." Her chest tightened at his words. "What if I'm not her?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if you're wrong?" "Then I'll still be grateful," Elias said, his voice steady despite his weakness. "Grateful for the chance to meet you. But Isabel, I don't think I'm wrong." She looked at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. For the first time, she saw not just a stranger but a man who had been shattered by loss, a man clinging to a hope that had eluded him for so long. And in that moment, she felt her walls begin to crack. Elias felt the weight of his words lingering in the air as Isabel sat in stunned silence. The delicate balance between hope and doubt in her hazel eyes mirrored the turmoil in her heart. For so long, she had lived a life she thought was her own. But now the possibility of an entirely different story clawed at the edges of her mind. She glanced back at the photograph of Lily on the bedside table, then at Elias, his frailty betraying years of heartbreak. "I don't know how to feel," Isabel admitted softly, her voice trembling. "If you're right, if I am her, what does that mean for everything I've ever known?" Elias reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and placed it gently over hers. "It doesn't erase your past," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "It adds to it. The woman who raised you, she loved you, I'm sure of it. But I lost you once, and I don't want to lose you again. All I ask is a chance to find the truth." Together, Isabel looked at him, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't pull away. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, really wonder, if what he was saying could be true. She thought of the birthmark on her hand, the crescent moon-shaped charm bracelet, and the faint memories of a childhood she could never quite piece together. Could it all fit? She took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's find out." The next morning, Elias arranged for a DNA test. Isabel hesitated as the nurse gently swabbed the inside of her cheek, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. Across from her, Elias watched with a mix of anticipation and fear. He wanted to believe, needed to believe, but a small part of him feared what the results might say. When it was over, the nurse assured them that the results would be expedited. "It should take a few days," she said kindly. "We'll call you as soon as we know." The days that followed were excruciating. Isabel returned to her shop, throwing herself into her work to distract from the gnawing anxiety. She found herself looking at the small wooden box more often, running her fingers over the charm bracelet and the faded photographs. She thought of the woman who had raised her, of the love and care she had received, and wondered how her mother would feel about what was unfolding. Elias, meanwhile, spent his time preparing for both possibilities. He wanted to show Isabel what her life had been, what it could have been, if the accident hadn't taken her away. He carefully laid out old photographs, small trinkets from Lily's childhood, and even the dress she had worn on her last birthday. Each item brought back a flood of memories, bittersweet and beautiful. Finally, the day arrived. Isabel was at the shop when her phone rang. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miss Isabel? This is Dr. Hampton. We have the results." Her breath caught. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and then the doctor said, "The test confirms it. You are biologically related to Mr. Elias." The phone slipped from Isabel's hand, clattering onto the counter. She stared at it, her mind racing as the words sank in. Slowly, she picked it up and thanked the doctor, her voice shaky. Elias was sitting in his study when Isabel arrived at the mansion later that afternoon. She stood in the doorway, clutching the charm bracelet tightly in her hand. He looked up, his expression unreadable, as she stepped inside. "It's true," she said softly. "I'm your daughter." Elias exhaled a shaky breath, his eyes filling with tears. "Lily," he whispered, the name catching in his throat. "You're home." She crossed the room, her steps tentative, and knelt beside his chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without hesitation, Elias pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she might disappear again. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." Isabel held him tightly, her own tears falling freely. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know you were looking for me." They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, two souls finding solace in each other after years of separation and pain. Finally, Isabel pulled back slightly, looking at him through tear-filled eyes. "I want to know everything," she said. "About her, about me." Elias nodded. "And I want to know everything about you," he said. "The years we lost, they're gone, but we have this moment, and I promise I won't waste it." Over the next few hours, they talked. Elias showed her the photographs and mementos he had saved, sharing stories of her childhood and the joy she had brought to his life. Isabel, in turn, told him about the woman who had raised her, the life she had built, and the quiet longing she had always felt for something she couldn't name. As the sun set, casting a warm golden glow over the room, Isabel reached for the charm bracelet. "This always felt special to me," she said, her voice soft. "Now I know why." Elias smiled, his face lighting up for the first time in years. "It was a part of you, a part of us." For the first time, Isabel felt a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. The pieces of her life, scattered and fragmented for so long, were finally beginning to come together. The weeks that followed the revelation were a whirlwind of emotion and quiet rediscovery. For Elias and Isabel, each day brought new stories, shared memories, and a growing bond that felt both familiar and foreign. The gap of 20 years could never truly be closed, but they were determined to build something meaningful in the time they had left. Elias's health remained fragile, but the joy of having Isabel back in his life seemed to breathe new energy into him. He spent his days guiding her through the estate, showing her pieces of her past that he had lovingly preserved, her favorite childhood books, drawings she had made as a toddler, and the teddy bear that had been her constant companion. Each item sparked a flicker of recognition in Isabel, as though the memories were buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. One evening, they sat together in the garden, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers. The soft glow of lanterns cast a golden hue over the sprawling lawns. Isabel leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting upward to the stars. "I always felt like something was missing," she said quietly. "I had a good life with my mother, but there was always this emptiness, like a piece of me was lost." Elias reached over and took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "You were never lost to me," he said. "Even when the world told me to give up, I couldn't. I knew you were out there somewhere." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes as she looked at him. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said, her voice breaking. "I wish I could have found you sooner." Elias shook his head, his own eyes glistening. "None of that matters now. What matters is that we're here, together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the night filled with the gentle hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in years, Elias felt a sense of peace wash over him. The ache in his heart, though not entirely gone, was no longer unbearable. Isabel's presence had filled a void he thought would remain empty forever. In the days that followed, Isabel began to explore her new role in Elias's life. She balanced her time between running her shop and visiting the estate, slowly integrating herself into a life she never imagined would be hers. The grandeur of the mansion, once intimidating, now felt comforting, a symbol of the family she had reclaimed. Elias, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. He began journaling his memories of Lily's early years, sharing them with Isabel so she could understand the father-daughter bond they once had. It was his way of preserving the past while embracing the future. One afternoon, Isabel stood in the nursery, her fingers tracing the edges of the small bed that had once been hers. The room had remained untouched for years, a silent monument to Elias's grief. Now, it felt like a bridge between the life she had lived and the life she had rediscovered. "I think it's time to let this room go," Elias said from the doorway, his voice soft but resolute. Isabel turned to him, surprised. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded, a bittersweet smile on his face. "This room was a way to keep her alive in my mind," he said. "But you're here now. I don't need a shrine. I need to make room for who you are today." Isabel walked over to him and wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for holding on, for never giving up." Elias hugged her tightly, his heart swelling with a mix of sadness and joy. "You gave me a reason to hold on," he said. "You're my reason." The day they decided to pack up the nursery was a quiet one. Together, they carefully boxed up the toys, books, and clothes, each item a memory cherished but no longer necessary. They chose to donate many of the items, turning grief into a gesture of hope for other families. As they carried the last box out of the room, Elias paused in the doorway, taking one final look. "Goodbye, Lily," he said softly, his voice filled with love. "And hello, Isabel." If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, subscribe, and share to help this channel grow. Thank you for your support.